Always put your silly putty back in its egg, or it will run slowly away.
Swatch watches!
Way cool! They're into the same stuff we are!
They punished us for the very things that made the 1980s magical. Our toys, our clothes, our music, our freedom. What did we lose when being a kid started getting you written up? They were banned, torn up, and labeled as a threat to the classroom. And yet, they were the one thing you never left home without. Garbage Pail Kids weren't just trading cards. They were proof that the world could be gross, chaotic, and hysterically unfair, and still make you laugh. With their snot-soaked puns, exploding heads, and wildly inappropriate names, these little stickers captured everything our parents tried to shield us from. That's exactly why we love them. We didn't just collect them, we smuggled them, traded them in secret like they were cash in a black market underworld. You were risking more than your recess. Kids got sent to the office, cards were confiscated, and some were even publicly destroyed by teachers trying to set an example. But no punishment could erase the rush of finding a rare one, or the thrill of a friend passing you atom bomb under the desk. These weren't just cards. They were a symbol of rebellion, humor, resistance, and ownership of something truly ours. When the adults freaked out, it only made them cooler. Because the truth was, they weren't scared of the cards. They were scared of what it meant when kids found power in something they didn't approve of. When did cardboard jokes become a revolution? You did not just wear parachute pants, you arrived in them. The swish-swish sound with every step announced your presence like a theme song. Bright colors, dozens of zippers, and sometimes even reflective panels, they were a walking protest against beige conformity. We saw them in music videos, on breakdancers, and in our wildest daydreams of being someone cool. Wearing them to school felt like crossing an invisible line. You knew you might get sent home, and that was part of the thrill. The rulebook said they were distracting or gang-related, but what they really meant was these pants gave kids confidence they were not supposed to have. You couldn't sit quietly and go unnoticed in parachute pants. That was the point. You became loud. Visually and literally, you became someone to look at. You were daring the world to try and tone you down. Some teachers rolled their eyes. Others wrote you up. But you didn't care. Because in those pants, you weren't just another student. You were a renegade. You were a performer. You were a billboard for your own identity. In a decade obsessed with appearances, you finally had something to say. Why was wearing confidence something to be punished? You were not just carrying a cassette player. You were carrying a secret universe of sound, your own personal rebellion, slipped into your pocket between history class and gym. The Walkman was magic. Push play, and you were no longer in a school hallway. You were on stage, on tour, anywhere but here. Your favorite songs were loaded like weapons, tapes rewound to the best part, headphones hidden under your hoodie, the volume low enough to get away with it, high enough to drown out the boredom. But that illusion shattered the second a teacher noticed the wires. Hand it over. No warning, no sympathy. It went into the drawer, maybe for a week, maybe forever. They said it was a distraction, that it broke your focus, but really, it broke their control. The Walkman was the one thing they could not monitor. Your music, your mood, your identity, all locked behind those spongy little headphones. We weren't tuning out. We were tuning in to something that made us feel alive. It was escape. It was comfort. And when they took it away, it hurt more than just losing a gadget. Why was needing a little bit of joy seen as a threat? You tore open the pouch like you were in the dugout, not the third row of math class. Big League Chew was shredded bubble gum in a pouch that looked way too much like chewing tobacco. And that was exactly why we loved it. It was gritty. It was bold. It made us feel like rebels in training. Stuffing a wad in your mouth, chomping with exaggerated confidence, you weren't just a kid chewing gum. You were an athlete, a rock star, a little outlaw with a sugar addiction. But the teachers? Oh, they hated it. They said it was messy, distracting, inappropriate. They didn't want to explain to concerned parents why their kids were pretending to chew tobacco. So they banned it. They made you spit it out. Sometimes they even called home. But they missed the point entirely. We weren't mimicking bad habits. We were playing a part, trying on the grown-up world for size. That was the whole thrill of the 1980s. We wanted to feel bigger than we were. And in that moment, blowing absurd bubbles with neon pink gum that looked like it belonged in a biker bar, we were. What was so threatening about pretend power? The slap could be heard across the cafeteria. That crack of metal snapping around a wrist wasn't just a sound. It was a signal. You had one, and that made you someone. Slap bracelets were cheap, colorful, and slightly dangerous. Basically everything a good trend should be. They looked like harmless fun. But to school administrators, they were a liability waiting to happen. One rumor about a kid cutting themselves, and suddenly they were banned across districts. But we still wore them. We smuggled them in pencil cases, snapped them under desks, and wore them over sleeves like badges of resistance. They were not just bracelets. They were noisemakers, fashion statements, weapons in an imaginary war of cool versus control. You could trade them, color coordinate them, or just see how many you could wear at once without getting caught. Teachers confiscated them with the same intensity they used for actual disruptions. Why? Because they weren't in on the joke. They didn't understand how much one stupid piece of coiled metal meant to a kid trying to feel visible. It was never about the bracelet. It was about the thrill. When did having fun become a disciplinary issue? They weren't just toys. They were our cast of characters, our secret arsenal, our emotional support in plastic form. He-Man, G.I. Joe, Optimus Prime, tiny heroes that lived in our backpacks and pockets, pulled out during bathroom breaks or under the desk when the teacher wasn't looking. But when they did catch you, confiscated, scolded, sometimes even sent home with a note. Toys weren't allowed in the classroom. But no one bothered to ask why we brought them in the first place. It wasn't about defying rules. It was about survival. These figures were extensions of our identity, of the stories we were too shy or too bored to say out loud. They gave us power in a space where we had none. We staged epic battles under our breath during spelling tests. We gave them voices when our own felt too small. And we felt braver, funnier, stronger for it. But the adults only saw distraction, never creativity. They didn't understand that those tiny fists and molded capes helped us make sense of the world. Or maybe they did, and that's what scared them. Why did pretending make them so uncomfortable? You knew you'd get in trouble for repeating that joke, but you said it anyway. Eddie Murphy's Raw wasn't just comedy, it was cultural fire. Bootlegged on VHS, played too loud at sleepovers, memorized line for line, it was everything we weren't supposed to hear. And that was the point. Saying those lines at school, even whispering them to a friend, was like setting off a firecracker in a library. Teachers didn't laugh. They called parents, wrote you up, told you that kind of language had no place in school. But for us, it wasn't about being dirty. It was about being fearless. Raw gave us a script to push against the world, to experiment with voice and timing and tone. It taught us the rhythm of grown-up speech, the power of shock, and the joy of forbidden laughter. Even if we didn't understand every punchline, we understood the thrill. We weren't just repeating jokes. We were testing how far our voices could go. When did laughter become something that needed permission? You didn't wake up with hair like that. You earned it. With gel, time, defiance, and maybe some kitchen scissors. Punk hair in the 1980s was not an accident. It was a message. And for schools, that message was unacceptable. You could walk into class with a neatly pressed shirt and aced homework, but if your hair stood up like a rebellion, you were a problem. Dress code violation, disruptive appearance, immediate visit to the principal's office. But to us, the hair wasn't just style. It was armor. It was identity. It meant we were choosing our own narrative in a system that handed us the same bland one every day. Mohawks, bright streaks, or sculpted spikes were not distractions. They were declarations. Even if you didn't fully understand the politics of punk, you understood the power of being looked at and not ignored. And being told to fix it? That was the first time many of us learned what conformity really felt like. When did standing out become an act of disobedience? You didn't just write a message, you crafted it. Each note folded into a tiny perfect triangle or a heart or a hidden envelope, designed to travel silently from desk to desk like a coded secret. In the pre-texting world, passing notes was both communication and performance. What did it say? Who was it for? Would it make someone laugh or blush? These scraps of paper carried everything: confessions, apologies, gossip, hope. But if a teacher saw it mid-transfer, torn up, read aloud, embarrassment followed by detention. Schools cracked down, calling it cheating, distraction, or worse. But they missed the soul of it. Notes were how we survived in classrooms where we felt invisible. They were how we said, "I see you," when no one else was looking. They were how we made friends, started crushes, ended feuds. The paper was cheap. The words were not. Why was connection treated like contraband? They were ridiculous. A rubber ball trapped in a plastic disc designed for chaos. Pogo balls were pure joy and guaranteed bruises. You jumped on them not to go anywhere but just to bounce. 1 second you were flying, the next you were eating pavement. But that was part of the deal. At recess, kids lined up to take their turn, knowing full well that gravity was always waiting. But then came the bans. Too many rolled ankles. Too many nurse visits. And just like that, the bounciest toy of the decade was labeled too dangerous. But danger wasn't the point. The point was flight. Brief, wobbly, glorious flight. You weren't just jumping. You were defying every adult warning. You were risking scrapes for 5 seconds of magic. And when the pogo balls were gone, it wasn't safety we felt. It was loss. When did fun become something we needed to be protected from? No one taught you how to draw it. You just knew. The cool S, with its 6 lines, sharp edges, and hypnotic symmetry, spread through schools like a secret handshake. You could find it scratched into desks, hidden in notebook margins, even doodled in yearbooks like some ancient symbol of belonging. It wasn't tied to a brand. It wasn't in a cartoon. It was just there. For kids in the 1980s, it was one of the first things you drew that made you feel cool without asking permission. But not everyone appreciated the aesthetic. Teachers scolded students for graffiti. Some even claimed it was gang-related. Schools tried to erase it like it was dangerous ideology instead of a harmless doodle. But we kept drawing, over and over. Not because we were trying to make a statement, but because it felt good to leave a little mark that was ours. It was a symbol that no adult could explain or claim. It belonged entirely to us. And maybe that's why they hated it. Because they didn't understand it. Because it meant we didn't always need their permission to create something that mattered to us. Why did a few lines on paper feel so threatening? They were sparkly. They were translucent. They were everything a pair of sneakers was not. Jelly shoes, made of soft, colorful plastic and always one size too uncomfortable, were a staple of every 1980s kid's wardrobe. You wore them because they made you feel like you were walking on glitter. And then you wore them to gym class, which was your first mistake, because those magical little shoes turned into slipping hazards on polished floors. PE teachers didn't care that they were fashionable. They cared that you were a lawsuit waiting to happen. You'd be benched, sent to the nurse, maybe even have to call home for real shoes. But we loved the way they caught the light when we walked. They made you feel like a disco ball on the playground. Some kids even matched them with scrunch socks just to double down on the statement. You could hear them squeak down the hallway like a fashion warning siren. Wearing jelly shoes was like saying, "I know these aren't practical, and I don't care." But we wore them anyway, because jelly shoes were not about comfort. They were about style, expression, standing out. You weren't wearing shoes. You were wearing a statement, and every time they told you to take them off, it felt like being told to tone yourself down. They weren't just unsafe, they were unacceptable, too shiny, too loud, too fun. But you wore them because you knew that feeling good about how you looked was worth the risk. When did joy start needing adult approval? On the surface, it looked educational. a blank list of nouns, verbs, and adjectives meant to be filled in by curious young minds. Teachers loved Mad Libs until they didn't, because we found the loophole, the joke, the way to turn a vocabulary exercise into the funniest thing we'd ever read. Give a group of kids a list of grammar prompts, and it will take about 5 minutes before someone writes "but" or "fart" as their answer. Mad Libs became an underground comedy club during lunch, a way to make the quietest kid in class cry with laughter over the phrase "fluffy underpants rocket." But once teachers started seeing the finished product, game over. Pages confiscated, books banned. We'd wait for the perfect moment, right in the middle of quiet reading time, to whisper our Mad Lib endings to each other. The giggles were impossible to contain. They connected us in a way grammar books never could. Every silly word felt like a protest against being bored out of our minds. We weren't mocking education. We were making it fun. Suddenly, the silly little language activity was treated like contraband. Not because it was wrong, but because it was too right. Too good at unleashing creativity. Too perfect for inserting just the right dose of chaos into a dull school day. Mad Libs taught us the most powerful lesson of all. Words matter, even the dumb ones, especially the dumb ones. Why did laughter in the margins make adults so uncomfortable? It was the anthem of every kid who felt invisible at the dinner table. Parents Just Don't Understand hit harder than any pop song had a right to. When that beat dropped at a school dance or assembly, the crowd lost it. Not because it was rebellious, but because it was honest. It gave voice to everything we wanted to say but didn't dare. The missed cues, the awkward clothes, the constant confusion of being a kid in a world ruled by people who didn't get it. But schools didn't like it. Administrators said it encouraged disrespect. Some even banned it from dances altogether. We weren't trying to start a revolution. We were just trying to sing our truth. The song was funny, sure, but behind the jokes were real feelings no adult seemed to notice. It was the first time pop culture said exactly what we were all thinking. When teachers silenced it, it only proved we were right. Maybe they didn't understand because they weren't supposed to. That was the irony. A song that told the truth was treated like a lie. But we didn't stop playing it. We memorized every line, shouted the chorus, and felt seen for the first time. It wasn't about hating our parents. It was about being heard. And when they tried to silence it, it proved the point even more. Why was honesty mistaken for rebellion? It was the sound of rebellion in homeroom. Rip. That long, tearing noise of Velcro being pulled open on a trapper keeper, the loudest school supply in the building. These binders were works of art. Bright neon covers, wild patterns, pop culture characters front and center. They were not just organizational tools, they were identity in binder form. But the Velcro? That was the problem. It echoed off the walls like a slap in the face to silence. One trapper keeper could derail a lecture. Some teachers banned them outright, replacing them with dull, silent folders. They said it was about noise, but really, it was about control. Opening a trapper keeper wasn't just about grabbing a pencil, it was about making an entrance. The sound had rhythm, like flipping a page in your own personal comic book. We compared ours like trading cards, who had the cooler cover, the better pockets, the wildest insert. They made us feel organized and important, like mini executives with bubblegum budgets. It was the only office we were allowed to run. Trapper keepers let us choose how we looked, how we sorted our notes, how we showed up. Every rip of Velcro was a reminder that we weren't just passive learners. We were people with preferences, with voices. And sometimes our voices were loud. Why was being organized only acceptable if it was boring? It wasn't just about telling time, it was about making a statement. Swatch watches were like wearing a comic book on your wrist. Bright colors, funky patterns, sometimes layered with multiple bands just because you could. Kids turned their wrists into runways, each watch clashing with the next in the most fabulous way. But in class, all that fun became a problem. Teachers said they were a distraction. You weren't allowed to look at your wrist. You weren't allowed to talk about your wrist. Heaven forbid your Swatch made a beep during a spelling quiz. Some kids would tap the face during class just to see if the teacher noticed. Others would swap them secretly, creating underground watch clubs that teachers tried to shut down. You could tell a lot about someone by the pattern on their Swatch. Comic book kid, neon rebel, future fashion icon. It wasn't just an accessory, it was identity on a strap. For a generation learning who they were, the Swatch was a perfect ticking mirror. The irony was painful. We were taught to value punctuality. But when we did it with style, it suddenly became a problem. Some schools even tried to enforce neutral accessories, no glitter, no neon, no personality, but we wore them anyway. Because time isn't just about minutes, it's about moments, and Swatch made those moments count. Why did being on time have to mean blending in? It beeped, constantly. That tiny pixelated egg thing in your pocket had needs: food, play, sleep, cleanup. A full-time digital pet with zero chill. The Tamagotchi craze hit like wildfire, and classrooms were not prepared. 1 minute you're solving long division, the next your Tamagotchi is beeping its death rattle because you forgot to clean up its pixel poop. Teachers were done. Confiscations were swift. Some schools wrote them into the rule book: no electronic pets. You'd hear one beep across the room and 20 kids would reach into their pockets in panic. We fed them during bathroom breaks, in our laps under the table, or behind open textbooks like secret agents. Some kids held actual funerals when theirs died. There were real tears, real grief, for something no bigger than a keychain. We weren't being disruptive. We were learning how to care for something, even if no one else took it seriously. But kids didn't stop bringing them. We smuggled them in our socks, hid them inside pencil cases, snuck them a quick snack between spelling and social studies. Because even if it was just pixels, it mattered. It taught us about responsibility, even if that responsibility was keeping a tiny alien creature alive between spelling tests. The stakes felt weirdly real, and so did the loss when it was taken away. Why was caring for something, even digitally, seen as a problem? They were soft, they were squishy, they were irresistible. Koosh balls were the tactile dopamine hit no kid could ignore. Bright colors, spaghetti-like rubber strands, tossing them back and forth felt like holding a living stress ball. But in class, that was a different story. They rolled, they bounced, they got thrown, accidentally or not. And teachers had enough. What looked like an innocent toy became public enemy number one. Some kids used them to pass secret notes, tucked into the rubbery strands like spy messages. Others used them to measure how bored they were. The more stretching and bouncing, the worse the lesson. Teachers saw chaos. We felt calm. For a lot of us, those silly strands were the only thing keeping our minds in the room. You'd get it taken away, maybe even a note home. But here's what they missed. For anxious kids, fidgeters, quiet ones who didn't speak up, koosh balls were a lifeline. They gave your hand something to do when your brain felt like running. They grounded you, and they were fun, which apparently was their real crime. When did being focused mean sitting still and suffering? They changed color with heat, like magic. You'd walk into school one shade, and 5 minutes later, your armpits were bright purple. Hypercolor shirts were alive. They were science. They were style. They were proof that fashion didn't have to be boring. But schools hated them. Dress code violations came fast and hard. Too distracting, they said. Inappropriate, if the color change drew attention to the wrong place. Some teachers claimed they made other kids uncomfortable. Suddenly, sweat became a disciplinary issue. You weren't just marked for fashion, you were marked for your body reacting to the world. Kids joked, but deep down, we started feeling self-conscious. The very shirt meant to express ourselves started getting us in trouble for simply being alive. Hypercolor was supposed to be fun, but it ended up showing us how uncomfortable schools were with change, especially the kind they couldn't control. But it wasn't the shirt, it was the freedom, the expression, the fact that you could wear change on your sleeve. We weren't trying to show off, we were trying to feel something, to wear something that reacted to us. And that made us feel powerful. When did color become a cause for discipline? They were rewards, but they were also obsession. Scratch and sniff stickers turned worksheets into treasure hunts. Grape, root beer, pizza, even skunk. You'd scratch the surface with your fingernail and sniff. The scent hit your brain like a memory you didn't know you had. Kids collected them, traded them, peeled them off and re-sniffed until the scent was gone. But teachers quickly noticed a problem. Stickers disrupted class. Kids scratching, giggling, passing sticker books back and forth. Worse, some scents were so strong they filled the room. One bad reaction from a sensitive student? Banished. We turned them into currency. One root beer sticker could get you 3 bananas and a cherry. Sticker albums were sacred artifacts, guarded like treasure maps. Kids got into arguments over duplicates or whether a skunk sticker was a punishment or a prize. The smells clung to our books, our sleeves, even our fingers long after recess ended. It was messy, ridiculous, and deeply human, the kind of joy you can't standardize or score. Suddenly, stickers were a liability. The very thing meant to motivate you became forbidden, but we kept them in pencil cases, tucked them in notebooks, carried them like perfume for our childhood. Why did delight need to be regulated? They looked like ordinary books, but they weren't. Inside their flimsy paperback covers lived worlds we controlled, stories where we were the heroes, making decisions every few pages that would change the ending. One wrong turn, and you plummeted off a cliff. Choose correctly, and you discovered buried treasure. Choose your own adventure books were a literary revolution for kids who didn't think of themselves as readers. And that was part of the problem, because once you cracked one open in class, especially during silent reading, you weren't coming back. The textbook on your desk didn't stand a chance. Math problems became meaningless when you had to decide whether to open the haunted door or run for your life. Teachers noticed. Pages were flipped too quickly. Eyes darted, not scanning but leaping. Some instructors banned the books outright, arguing they were too chaotic, too disorienting, too fun to be serious literature. What they really meant was they were too effective, too good at pulling kids in, too unpredictable. These books handed kids the narrative wheel, and that didn't sit well in a system built on obedience and structure. They weren't just distracting, they were dangerous because they made kids realize they had choices. And once you gave a child even a taste of agency, it was hard to make them go back to fill-in-the-blank worksheets without asking, what happens next? Why did choosing your own story suddenly mean you were reading the wrong one? It started as a tribute. You tied the red bandana around your forehead, just like Rambo did. It didn't mean you were at war, it meant you wanted to look cool, tough, untouchable. But within the first few steps into school, the whispers started. Teachers pulled you aside, principals gave you that look. That's not appropriate. That could be seen as a gang symbol. Suddenly, you weren't just a kid imitating a movie hero, you were a threat, and you didn't understand why. The bandana was a piece of cloth, a costume, a way to feel brave when everything else in your life felt small. You weren't trying to be violent, you were trying to be seen. But the 1980s were full of fear of youth, fear of gangs, fear of image. And a headband, no matter how innocent, was loaded with meaning, especially if you were a kid from the wrong neighborhood, especially if you wore it with pride. You got sent home, you got written up, and maybe you never wore it again, but you remembered what it felt like to put it on. Like armor, like power, like you were finally more than just a face in a desk. Why did pretending to be strong make adults so afraid? It started off innocent. A little egg-shaped capsule pulled from your pocket, cracked open to reveal a pink lump of goo. Silly Putty. Software bouncy, quiet. It could stretch across your desk or bounce off the wall. You pressed it to the comics page and it made a perfect wobbly copy. It was part toy, part science experiment. And for a moment, you weren't bored anymore. But that moment passed quickly once a teacher caught on. They didn't see Silly Putty as harmless. They saw it as messy, distracting. One stray bounce or splatter and suddenly it was contraband. You got a warning, then a write-up, maybe even a call home if it left a stain. But the punishment always felt out of proportion. because we weren't trying to be disruptive. We were trying to stay sane. Silly Putty gave our hands something to do when the lesson dragged on. It gave our minds a little relief in a place that demanded constant stillness. It wasn't about being disrespectful. It was about holding on to something soft when the world was hard. And yet, it was treated like a crime. Why was comfort always the first thing to be taken away? They lit up like secrets after dark. Glow-in-the-dark stickers were tiny pieces of magic stuck to our notebooks, lunch boxes, pencil cases, even the inside of lockers. Stars, ghosts, dinosaurs. You'd stare at them during class, barely able to wait for night so you could watch them come alive. But the glow wasn't the problem. It was the attention. Teachers caught on. Kids were trading them, showing them off, charging each other a quarter for the rare ones. Soon, anything that glowed was declared a distraction. Some schools banned them outright. They said they caused jealousy, arguments, unnecessary focus on non-educational materials. But what they missed was how personal they were. These weren't just decorations. They were quiet acts of ownership. Your Trapper Keeper might be school-issued, but the glowing moon sticker, that was yours. And it meant something. That in a gray, rule-filled world, you could still make a little corner of it shine. You could still carry wonder in a binder. But they took it away. Just like that. And you were left with supplies that no longer felt like yours. Why was light, in any form, seen as a problem in a place meant to help us grow? You didn't own a stage, but you had the gloves. Fingerless, black lace, and full of attitude. They weren't warm. They weren't practical. They were fashion, stolen straight from the music videos that played in bursts on MTV when your parents weren't looking. Madonna made them iconic. You made them yours. You put them on and felt something shift, like you were no longer invisible, like you were allowed to take up space. But the second you walked into school, it all fell apart. Teachers stared. Other kids whispered. You were told to remove them, that they were distracting, inappropriate, too adult. Some schools even listed them by name in new dress code rules. What they really meant was too expressive. Because those gloves weren't just fashion. They were rebellion, femininity with teeth, power with polish. They told the world you weren't afraid to be loud or weird or glamorous in a hallway full of conformity. But that was the danger. The gloves turned a quiet girl into someone with presence. And the school system didn't have space for that. They wanted you in neutral tones, head down, hands empty. They didn't want lace or sparkle or statements. So they took the gloves, and with them, a little bit of your voice. Why did growing up mean dressing like you were never meant to be noticed? They were not just actors. They were a reflection in the mirror of every teenager who ever felt lost, loud, or completely misunderstood. The Brat Pack did not invent high school drama, but they made it feel real, electric, and terrifyingly close to home. When you watched Molly Ringwald cry in detention, it was not just acting. It was every hallway humiliation, every awkward crush, and every secret you thought nobody else could possibly understand. John Hughes gave them the scripts, but it was the actors. Emilio Estevez, Judd Nelson, Ali Sheedy, Anthony Michael Hall, who gave the 80s its voice. These films did not just entertain, they defined. The Breakfast Club was not a movie, it was a therapy session. 16 Candles felt like a personal diary read aloud. Pretty in Pink asked whether love could survive cliques in class. They gave heart to rebellion, soul to sarcasm, and face to the faceless. The Brat Pack were not perfect, but they were ours. Messy, funny, fragile, and unforgettable. Their films dared to be earnest in a time of cynicism and cool, and decades later, they still feel like a warm letter from your teenage self, sealed in a VHS case, waiting to be remembered. Leaving kids alone in the car while shopping was as routine as carrying a grocery list. Parents would crack the windows, hand you a book or a juice box, and lock the doors. Then they would disappear into the store, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes much longer. You sat in the front seat, pressed buttons, turned knobs, maybe climbed into the back. If you were lucky, the radio stayed on. If you were younger, you played pretend. The car smelled like old vinyl and the warmth of the sun. Sometimes it got too hot. Sometimes you cracked the window a little more, but nobody panicked. Nobody called the police. It was a different kind of trust, one born of a culture that saw parked cars as safe spaces and errands as moments of independence. Today, leaving a child alone in a vehicle, even for a moment, is considered dangerous and illegal in many states. Amber alerts and heartbreaking headlines have changed the law and the conversation. What was once ordinary now feels like neglect. But for kids of the 1980s, it was a chance to wait, watch, and grow up a little. And if sitting alone in a hot car seems reckless today, just wait until you hear what passed for child car safety back then. Because most of us did not even have booster seats. If you were a kid in the 1970s, chugging water straight from the garden hose was basically a rite of passage. You would be out playing tag, riding bikes, or building questionable tree forts and suddenly realize you were dying of thirst. No one ran inside for a water bottle. You went for the hose. You cranked the knob, let the sun-heated water blast out for a few seconds, and then put your mouth right on the nozzle. No one asked where the hose had been or what might be growing inside it. Rubbery taste? Totally normal. Mystery specks? Built character. Parents barely noticed unless you soaked your shirt. Nobody thought twice about what kinds of chemicals were leaching from the plastic or whether small bugs had made it their home. We just drank and kept running. But when it came to food, there were rules. Except during Halloween, when those rules took a break and you took candy from strangers with zero hesitation. In the 80s, getting fit was not just about health. It was about style. It was about glory. Aerobics hit America like a high kick to the face, and suddenly, everyone was sweating in sync to pulsing beats and neon spandex. Jane Fonda led the charge. Her workout tapes were gospel. Living rooms became fitness studios. Leotards, sweatbands, leg warmers. This was not just exercise. It was performance. You did not just move, you burned. And you looked good doing it. Celebrities jumped on the trend. Gyms popped up everywhere. And for the first time, people wanted to be active and look fabulous while doing it. This was not a grim treadmill march. It was a dance. A celebration of energy, movement, and control. The 80s made fitness feel like fashion and made health feel fun. Men joined too, in cut-off shirts and short shorts, lifting weights in front of full-length mirrors. Aerobics videos sold by the millions. They were pop culture events, right up there with hit sitcoms and blockbuster movies. Fitness was in. Everyone was chasing that sculpted, sweat-glazed look. It was a movement, a mantra. And underneath the glitter and the bouncing was something real, a desire to take charge of your body, your mood, and your destiny. Driving after a few beers was seen as a minor risk, not a moral failing. In the 1980s, drinking and driving was common, so common it barely raised an eyebrow. Someone would leave a barbecue or a bowling alley, buzzed but smiling, and climb behind the wheel like it was just another Tuesday night. Sometimes they even brought a drink with them for the road, nestled between their legs or sitting in the cup holder before cup holders even existed. You might remember the clink of bottles under the seat or the faint scent of beer still on your uncle's breath as he drove you home. Nobody called it reckless, nobody flinched. It was treated the same way as driving tired or driving in the rain. Risky, sure, but manageable if you knew what you were doing. Breathalyzers were rare. Police might give a warning, not a ticket. Getting pulled over meant a brief conversation, not a night in jail. Today, of course, the laws have changed, and for good reason. Drunk driving kills thousands. Campaigns like Mothers Against Drunk Driving helped turn the tide, showing the public what casual drinking behind the wheel really cost. But back then, it was not about recklessness. It was about a culture that had not yet connected its habits with their consequences. And if the idea of casual drinking while driving sounds dangerous now, just imagine what the air was like inside your favorite restaurant. Electric slimming belts were the miracle fitness gadget of the 1980s. Or so the ads claimed. Wrap it around your waist, plug it in, flip the switch, and prepare to get electrocuted into peak physical form. These belts sent pulsing electric shocks into your abdomen under the promise of stimulating muscles and burning fat. What they really did? Caused skin burns, fainting spells, and enough emergency room visits to make the Food and Drug Administration step in. They buzzed, jolted, and sometimes sparked, especially if you were sweaty, which the instruction manual encouraged. You'd lie there, twitching like a frog in biology class, convinced the pain meant it was working. These devices became so notorious that many were banned or pulled from shelves by the late 1980s. Today's fitness tech might still overpromise, but at least it doesn't literally jolt you awake. Unless you miss the 1980s, in which case, wait until you see what they handed to kids in the toy aisle next. A survival knife inspired by Rambo. Because what could go wrong? Riding bikes without helmets was not considered dangerous. It was considered growing up. Children in the 1980s owned scraped knees, stubbed toes, and chipped teeth like badges of honor. You grabbed your bike and took off the moment the sun came up, racing friends through alleys, sidewalks, and backyards. The wind whipped your face. The world blurred past. Helmets were rare. If anyone had one, it was likely for motocross or medical reasons. Most parents did not even think to suggest it. Bike safety was taught through scraped elbows, not pamphlets. You rode with your shoelaces untied, your backpack swinging, maybe even one hand holding a soda. Some bikes had pegs, others had banana seats, but almost none had helmets. Today, many states have helmet laws, especially for children under 18. Schools give lessons. Parents buy reflective gear. But for that earlier generation, the only thing protecting your head was your luck and your reflexes. It was risky, yes, but also exhilarating. And while today's parents would call that neglect, the freedom to take risks was part of what made childhood feel so vast. Just like thumbing a ride down the highway felt like part of growing up for teenagers and travelers alike. Madonna was not just a pop star, she was a cultural earthquake in stilettos. With every music video, every outfit, every defiant stare into the camera, she redefined what it meant to be a woman on stage. Like a Virgin was not just a song. It was a dare, a challenge to tradition, a celebration of contradiction. She was innocence and provocation, lace gloves and rosaries, punk attitude and disco flair. No one looked like her. No one acted like her. And that was the point. In a world trying to box in femininity, Madonna kicked the walls down in heels. She made fashion dangerous again. Layered bracelets, teased hair, oversized crucifixes. Suddenly, teen girls everywhere were dressing like her, talking like her, being her. Her fashion was not an accessory to her music. It was the message: be bold, be loud, be unapologetically you. She did not just influence trends, she created blueprints. And behind the sequins and fishnets was something deeper. The idea that pop could be powerful, that glam could be gritty, and that no one had to ask permission to be seen. Madonna turned rebellion into runway. She gave attitude a soundtrack. And for anyone growing up in the 80s, she was proof that being different could make you unforgettable. No seatbelt use was not just common, it was practically invisible. Cars came with seatbelts, but they were rarely used. Children piled into the back seat without a second thought, curling up with pillows, playing games, or hanging their heads out the window like golden retrievers. On long trips, siblings would wrestle or lie down to nap across the entire back row. Adults, too, often left their belts untouched, especially in the front passenger seat. The seatbelt light was just an annoying feature, easily ignored. There were no alarms, no relentless dings, just silence and freedom. Many people viewed seatbelts as unnecessary unless they were driving fast or on highways. Some even believed they were more dangerous during crashes. It was not until the late 1980s and early 1990s that states began to enforce seatbelt laws. Today, it is a non-negotiable. Not buckling up can cost you money, your license, or your child's safety. But back then, you were more likely to get in trouble for forgetting to bring home milk than for not wearing a belt. And if the roads were that casual, imagine how carefree kids were on their bikes, zooming through neighborhoods without a helmet in sight. The Garbage Pail Kids movie is the textbook example of a terrible idea being taken way too seriously. The trading cards were already controversial. Gross-out humor, exaggerated features, bodily functions turned into punchlines. But they were iconic. So naturally, someone decided to turn them into a full-length feature film. And it was a mess. The characters were played by little people in horrifying animatronic masks that barely moved, giving every scene a nightmarish vibe. The plot? A vague attempt at a coming-of-age story with elements of science fiction and slapstick comedy, all of it soaked in questionable effects and even worse acting. Even die-hard fans of the cards walked out of theaters feeling like they had just lost a piece of their childhood. Critics called it one of the worst films ever made, and audiences agreed. It tanked at the box office, vanished from theaters, and was quietly swept under the rug. The only thing this movie managed to accomplish was proving that not all nostalgia belongs on the big screen. But if you think that was a bitter taste, just wait until we talk about a candy bar that tried to be classy and ended up at the bottom of the vending machine. It started with 6 colors, just 6. But somehow, it unlocked a puzzle that would challenge millions of minds and define an era. The Rubik's Cube was not just a toy. It was an obsession, a flex, a frustration, and a badge of honor, all crammed into a twisting, clicking square. You either solved it or you peeled the stickers off. There was no in-between. Classrooms, kitchens, and family living rooms were all temporary battlegrounds for who could line up the colors first. It looked simple, but it demanded patience, logic, and a kind of determination that made it feel like a test of character. And oh, the speed solvers, like magicians, like gods. The cube became a status symbol among kids and a stress toy for adults. It was everywhere: commercials, competitions, cereal box giveaways. You were not cool if you had not at least tried to conquer it. For a moment, the Rubik's Cube was the brainy heart of the decade, a symbol of what it meant to be smart and stylish. It taught an entire generation to keep twisting, keep trying, and keep believing that order could come from chaos. Letting kids ride standing up in the back seat was not just overlooked. It was often encouraged. The space between the 2 front seats was a coveted spot, a mini stage where children stood to give directions, tell stories, or just feel taller. It felt like driving without actually driving. Parents drove with one arm loosely draped over the passenger seat while a child stood between them, gripping the dashboard, peering out at the road like a co-pilot. In the back, kids slid across vinyl seats, bounced with each turn, or lay down and stared at the ceiling. There were no reminders to buckle up, because buckling up was not yet a rule. It was a nuisance. The seatbelt often stayed buried beneath the cushions or was jammed into the crack between the seats. Today, it is illegal for a child to ride without a proper car seat or restraint. Parents now face fines, or worse, for what was once everyday family travel. But back then, riding unrestrained was just another way to feel free. There was trust, or maybe just oblivion. Either way, it was the norm. And if today's laws would call that reckless, the next parenting habit would cause even more of an uproar. It took place in plain sight, often with a crowd watching. The VCR, a marvel that arrived in the 1970s, was akin to a magician in a box, granting us the power to capture time itself. Suddenly, TV schedules no longer dictated our lives. We could record, rewind, and relive our favorite moments at will. The VCR was the herald of home cinema, a concept so revolutionary that even its hefty price tag couldn't dampen its allure. It's a testament to its impact that phrases like "be kind, rewind" are etched in the collective memory of a generation. As DVDs and streaming services emerged, the VCR's star faded, but its legacy of shaping family movie nights and introducing the world to video rentals lives on. Diet Coke did not just arrive, it announced itself. It was 1982, and suddenly there it was, sleek, silver, and somehow cooler than everything else in your fridge. This was not just soda. It was soda with an attitude. People were becoming health conscious, and Coca-Cola knew it. They gave the world an alternative, and we grabbed it with both hands. The can itself looked futuristic. The taste was crisp, sharp, slightly rebellious. You could have your cake and drink it too. Diet Coke became the drink of choice for the fashion-forward, the calorie-conscious, and anyone trying to look good in a shoulder-padded suit. It was everywhere, at malls, in offices, on TV sets next to glowing VCRs. Celebrities held it like an accessory. Models posed with it like it was perfume. It was light. It was fizzy. And it meant something. It meant you were modern. It meant you cared about your image. It meant you could still enjoy life without the guilt. It was not just a beverage. It was a movement, a cool, carbonated promise that you could be smarter, sleeker, and savvier than the people drinking the red can. And in the 80s, that mattered. A lot. Letting kids roam the neighborhood alone was not just common in the 1980s. It was encouraged. Children would vanish after breakfast with a bike, a baseball glove, or just their imagination, and no one blinked an eye. They played near rivers, railroad tracks, junkyards, and alleys. They climbed trees and empty lots, chased each other through sprinkler-soaked lawns, and explored storm drains without ever considering the danger. No cell phones, no GPS. Just a promise to be back before dark, maybe. You followed the smell of backyard barbecue or the jingle of the ice cream truck to know where everyone had gathered. The streets raised them. Strangers were just people you had not met yet. The rule was simple. Stay together, watch out for your younger sibling, and come home when the porch lights came on. Parents trusted the neighborhood, and the neighborhood often looked out for them. There was an unspoken safety net woven through the community, invisible but strong. But today, letting a 10-year-old walk to the park alone can spark a visit from child services. Some parents have even faced legal charges for giving their kids the same freedom they once enjoyed. What was once viewed as independence is now labeled negligence. The culture of watchful fear has replaced the freedom of wandering youth. But if that sounds unsettling, it is nothing compared to what used to happen behind the wheel, while kids were in the back seat. Children riding in the front seats of cars was an everyday sight, and often a point of pride. Sitting up front made you feel older, more important. You got to fiddle with the radio, point at road signs, and chat with mom or dad like a co-pilot. No one thought about airbags because there were not any. Booster seats were rare, and height limits did not exist. Some kids were barely out of diapers, sitting inches from the windshield. It was not defiance, it was just convenience. Parents wanted to keep an eye on you, or maybe you just begged until they said yes. You might remember leaning over to see the map or falling asleep with your head against the door. Today, it is illegal in many states for children under a certain age or weight to ride in the front seat. Airbags are now both a safety feature and a reason for strict backseat policies. But back then, the rules were unspoken and the risks were invisible. And if you think sitting up front was bold, try remembering what they used to hand to kids on the 4th of July. Explosives in a paper bag. Aquanet's scented hairspray line hit the shelves in 1968, hoping to combine the hold of a hair helmet with the charm of a perfume ad. The brand was already a household name. By then, Aquanet had glued more bouffants in place than any other product on the market. But someone in marketing must have thought, you know what this cloud of chemicals needs? Flowers. So they rolled out a special line of floral-scented versions. There were rose, jasmine, even a spring breeze blend. The idea was to give users a refreshing, elegant aroma while locking their hairstyle in place for hours. But it backfired, fast. The floral notes clashed with every other scent in a person's routine. The smells mixed into something that made elevators unbearable. To make matters worse, the scent faded quickly, leaving behind the signature Aquanet chemical musk, just with a weird dying flower twist. Even die-hard Aquanet fans could not justify it. By the early 1970s, the line quietly disappeared from shelves. Aquanet stuck around, but its foray into fragrance was a short and smelly detour. But if you want a true example of how the 1960s misunderstood its audience, just look at the British bike that tried to win over American teens by shrinking everything they loved. There were bands, and then there were hair metal bands. They did not just play music, they exploded onto the stage. Bon Jovi, Mötley Crüe, Poison, these were not just names. They were icons with teased hair, eyeliner, and leather pants so tight they could probably break glass. The 80s were loud, flashy, and unapologetic, and hair metal was the soundtrack. These bands brought arena anthems and pyrotechnics and turned concerts into full-blown rock operas. They made being over the top a lifestyle. Power ballads met guitar solos that could melt your face off. It was glam, grit, and glory all rolled into a headbang, and they owned it. From the moment they strutted on stage, they dripped charisma and chaos. Music videos looked like wild fever dreams, smoke machines, motorcycles, women in fringe, and men who looked like peacocks in heat. And we loved it. Teens blasted them in bedrooms. Posters covered every inch of the wall. Even parents, reluctantly or not, knew the lyrics. These bands made rebellion look like theater, and for a generation that craved identity, they gave us swagger, eyeliner, and the kind of sound you could feel in your bones. Hair metal was not subtle, but neither was the 80s. Hitchhiking was once seen as adventurous, not reckless. People stuck out their thumbs with a smile and a sign, hoping for a ride and maybe a story. Soldiers on leave, college students on break, wanderers with a dream, they all relied on the kindness of strangers. Roads were filled with possibilities, and nobody thought twice about pulling over. You might remember watching someone hop into a stranger's car and wave goodbye, trusting the road and the driver. It was how many got from one town to the next, especially before cheap bus fares and ride-sharing apps. Parents might warn you to be careful, but that was the extent of the worry. Hitchhiking was not illegal in most places. It was resourceful. Over time, though, stories of assaults, disappearances, and crimes changed the narrative. Laws tightened. Signs went up, "No hitchhiking." Now, in many states, it is restricted or outright banned. The open road closed itself off. Hitchhiking became a symbol of risk rather than freedom. But for those who once stuck out their thumb and caught a ride with a stranger, it still lives in memory as a gesture of trust. And just as strangers were trusted, so were quiet children waiting patiently in cars, alone. It looked like something straight out of a haunted dollhouse and somehow got greenlit as a beauty product. The Rejuvenique face mask promised younger, firmer skin through electrical muscle stimulation, which is a fancy way of saying it zapped your face with little shocks. Advertised by a former soap opera star, the mask wrapped around your head like a plastic exoskeleton and turned your facial routine into something that felt like a scene from a horror film. The idea was that the stimulation would tone your face like a gym tones your body, but customers mostly reported mild burns, numbness, and the distinct feeling that they had made a terrible mistake. Despite airing on television with the enthusiasm of a late-night miracle cure, it flopped hard. It was the kind of product that felt less like a beauty tool and more like a sci-fi movie prop that somehow escaped the set. Still, you had to admire the ambition. If you could survive the Rejuvenique, surely you could survive anything the 1980s had to throw at you. And as it turns out, that next throw was straight at the kids, because someone thought gym fashion should start in elementary school. Hip-hop was born in the Bronx, but in the 80s, it exploded into every corner of American life. It was not just a sound, it was a movement. And when Run DMC hit the stage in Adidas tracksuits and shell-toe sneakers, you knew the world was about to change. This was more than music. It was poetry over beats, rhythm over silence, truth over noise. The 80s marked hip-hop's rise from underground parties to global power. LL Cool J, Public Enemy, Grandmaster Flash. These were not just rappers. They were messengers. Each lyric felt like a coded message from the streets, a heartbeat from the city itself. Hip-hop spoke about struggle, pride, injustice, and survival in a way that made you stop, listen, and feel. And the style? Just as fierce. Gold chains, Kangol hats, boom boxes on shoulders. This was fashion with purpose. The look was bold, but the voice behind it was louder. Breakdancing hit sidewalks like fire. Graffiti tagged the city with identity, and everywhere you turned, the bass dropped like a gavel. Hip-hop turned sneakers into icons and turned raw truth into chart toppers. It did not ask for a seat at the table. It built its own table, right there on the pavement. And anyone who came of age in the 80s knew they were witnessing the rise of a new American language, one that still speaks volumes. Got your own 80s school scandal? Share it below, like the video, and subscribe so we can keep breaking the rules together.